She arrived at the Harwick place on a Tuesday in late October, when the aspens had already lost their color, and the sky sat low and gray over the foothills like a lid pressed down on something that couldn't breathe. Her name was June Adler, though she hadn't used that name in the way people use a name that belongs to them, not since her husband walked out of their house in Lethbridge 18 months ago and left behind a mortgage she couldn't carry and a silence she didn't know what to do with. She was 27 years old. She had $43, a bedroll, and a canvas bag with a broken strap she kept meaning to fix. The truck she'd hitched a ride on dropped her at the junction of the gravel road, and the driver, a quiet Hutterite man who'd asked no questions and offered no opinions, pointed south with 2 fingers before pulling back onto the highway. June stood there for a moment watching the truck disappear, then picked up her bag and walked toward the tree line where a post with a rusted chain and a hand-painted sign read, "Harwick Creek Ranch. No trespassing." She walked through it anyway. The ranch house was smaller than she'd expected from the road. Weathered siding the color of old cream, a covered porch with a woodpile stacked neatly to the eaves on one side and a broken rocking chair on the other. Smoke from the chimney. A cattle dog, mottled gray and brown, one ear up and one ear folded, lifted its head from the porch steps and watched her come without barking. June stopped at the gate. "Hello," she called. Nothing for a moment. Then the screen door opened and a woman appeared. She was perhaps 65, maybe older, with white hair pulled back and an apron still on from whatever she'd been doing inside. She looked at June the way people in that country look at strangers, not unfriendly, exactly, but careful, measuring. "Can I help you?" the woman said. It wasn't quite a question. "I'm looking for work," June said. "I heard in town you might need help on the property. I can mend fence, move cattle, muck out stalls, whatever you need. I'm not asking much, just somewhere to sleep and a meal, that's all." The woman on the porch didn't answer right away. She looked at June's bag, at her boots, good boots, worn but cared for, and then back at her face. "Wait here," she said, and went back inside. June waited. The dog came down the steps slowly and sniffed her hand and then went back and lay down. She took that as a reasonable sign. The woman who came back was not the same woman, or rather, she was the same woman, but she had brought someone with her. He was tall and lean, somewhere in his late 60s, with a face like tanned saddle leather and eyes that were neither warm nor cold. He carried himself the way old ranchers carry themselves, with the particular kind of stillness that comes from spending decades outdoors doing physical work, where you learn not to waste motion. His name was Harold Harwick. He would not tell her this himself. His wife, whose name was Dorothy Harwick, would tell it to June later, after most of what would happen had already happened. But standing there at the gate that Tuesday, he was simply the man with the steady eyes, looking at June the way he might look at a piece of equipment he wasn't sure he trusted. "You said work," Harold said. "Yes, sir. What kind of work do you know?" I grew up on a quarter section north of Pincher Creek," June said. "My father ran Black Angus. I've worked 2 other ranches since then, one near Clarisholm and one in the Peace River country. I know cattle." Harold looked at her for a long time. Behind him, Dorothy stood quietly, in the doorway, and June could not read her expression. "We're not hiring," Harold said. "I know," June said. "I'm not asking to be hired. I'm asking to stay through the winter. I'll earn my keep. You won't have to pay me anything until spring, and if you decide I'm not worth keeping on, I'll go without argument." Harold's jaw moved slightly the way a man's jaw moves when he's thinking something he hasn't decided to say yet. "We've had drifters come through before," he said. "Looking for winter quarters." "I'm not a drifter," June said quietly. "I'm a person who needs to stop moving for a while. There is a difference between those 2 things, even if it's hard to put into words." Harold Harwick seemed to hear it. He didn't say anything for another long moment, then he looked at Dorothy, and Dorothy looked at him, and something passed between them that had no words at all. "You can sleep in the bunkhouse," Dorothy said finally. "One night. We'll see." That was how it started. What June did not say, standing at that gate, was any of the rest of it. She did not say that she had left Lethbridge in the spring with the vague idea of going west, and that the going west had turned into something slower and less purposeful than she'd planned. She did not say that she had been working odd jobs since April, waitressing in Fort Macleod, mucking stalls in Pincher Creek, a brief and disastrous attempt at waitressing again in Blairmore, and that none of it had held. She did not say that the real reason she'd come to the Harwick place specifically was because of a woman named Bet Seagram, who ran the feed store in Lundbreck, who had told her, unprompted, that the Harwicks had lost their hired man in August and were struggling to manage the fall work with just the two of them, and they were too proud to ask for help, and someone ought to just show up. June had thought about that for 3 days before she walked through the gate. The bunkhouse was clean, a narrow bed, a wood stove, a hook on the wall, and a shelf with a tin cup and a stub of candle. June put her bag on the floor, sat on the edge of the bed, and thought about the fact that she had nowhere else to be. That thought usually made her feel worse. That night, for some reason, it didn't. She was up before light. Harold was already in the barn when she found it, throwing hay in the pre-dawn gray, working with the efficiency of a man who had done the same thing 10,000 times. He heard her come in and didn't stop what he was doing. "Cattle won't move themselves," he said, which was not exactly a greeting, but wasn't exactly not one either. "Tell me what you need," June said. He told her. She did it. That was the first day. The Harwick property was 640 acres, a full section, most of it rolling pasture, with a creek running through the southeast corner that gave the ranch its name. They ran about 80 head of black Angus, which in that country and at that time of year meant getting the weaned calves sorted and the herd moved closer to the home pasture before the first hard frost locked everything up. There was also a stretch of fence on the north boundary that Harold said needed checking, 3 gates that needed rehinging, and a water line to the west dugout that had been running slow since August. June spent the first week not talking much and working steadily. She ate breakfast with Harold and Dorothy at the kitchen table and answered questions when asked and didn't push for conversation when it wasn't offered. Dorothy, she noticed, watched her, not suspiciously but with a kind of quiet attention, the way a woman watches someone she hasn't decided how to feel about yet. On the 4th day, Dorothy put a second cup of coffee on the table in front of June without being asked. On the 6th day, June fixed the water line to the west dugout. It took her most of the afternoon, and she came back to the house with mud to her elbows, and when she washed up at the outdoor tap, Dorothy appeared at the kitchen window and then disappeared, and when June came inside, there was a plate of cornbread on the counter with a cloth over it. Nothing was said about it. Some things don't need to be said. By the 2nd week, June understood the shape of what she'd walked into. Harold Harwick was a man who had run this land for 40 years, and the land had cost him, in the way land always costs the people who love it. His oldest son had left for Calgary in his 20s and never come back to ranching. He called sometimes, which was fine and good, but he was not coming back. His younger son had died in a combine accident 10 years ago, out on the Bennett place, helping a neighbor with harvest the way people in that country do. Dorothy didn't talk about this. Harold didn't either, but it was there in the house the way grief is always there in houses. Not loud, not sharp anymore, just present, folded into the walls. And now they were in their late 60s running a cattle operation that needed 2 strong people and a hired hand, with only 2 of the first category and none of the second, and the weight of it was beginning to show. Harold moved a little slower than he pretended. Dorothy's hands had begun to hurt in the mornings. June had seen her flexing them under the table before she picked up her coffee cup, the small, careful movement of someone managing something she wasn't going to mention. June had seen this before. Her own parents had done it, out north of Pincher Creek, until her mother's hip gave out and the whole thing finally came apart at the seams. There was a particular kind of pride in ranch families, not arrogance, not stubbornness exactly, but a deep reluctance to show anyone the place where the load was getting too heavy. as though admitting it would be the same as failing. She didn't say any of this to Harold or Dorothy. She just got up earlier. The third week was when the trouble started. It began with the fence on the north boundary. June had checked it in her first week, found 2 sections that needed staples and 1 post that had heaved with frost and needed resetting, and fixed them. But when she rode out that Monday morning to check the back pasture, she found a gap in the wire that hadn't been there before. Not a break, not a failure of old wire, but a clean cut. 3 strands, cut level, as though someone had come along that fence line with wire cutters and worked deliberately and carefully. 11 cattle were gone. June counted the rest twice to be sure. She rode back and told Harold. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Show me." They rode out together. Harold crouched by the fence and looked at the cut ends of the wire for a long time without speaking. Then he stood and looked north across the neighbor's land, and his expression was the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head, adding up things that had happened over a long time and were now adding up to something he didn't like. "Vickers," he said very quietly. It wasn't directed at June. She asked that evening after supper, when Harold had gone out to the barn. Dorothy sat across the kitchen table with her hands around her cup and looked out the window for a moment before she answered. The Vickers family owned the section to the north. The patriarch, a man named Gordon Vickers, now in his early 70s, had been running cattle on that land for 30 years, but the land itself had been in dispute since Harold's father's time, when a boundary survey had come back with results that didn't match the original homestead records. Nothing had ever been resolved formally. There had been lawyers at one point, and letters, and a meeting in Pincher Creek with a mediator that had ended badly and quietly. Since then, the dispute had sat between the 2 properties like a cold fire, not burning, not out. "Gordon was never a bad man," Dorothy said carefully. "But his son Merv is a different sort." She didn't say more than that. She didn't need to. June spent the next 3 days riding the fence lines. She found 2 more places where wire had been loosened. Not cut this time, just worked free of staples on the post, so it would look like age rather than interference. She took photographs with the small camera she kept in her saddlebag and wrote down the GPS coordinates on her phone. Then she went back to the house and sat at the kitchen table and told Harold what she'd found. Harold listened. He sat very still, the way he always sat when he was listening to something important, and he looked at the photographs and then he looked at June. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking you need to call the RCMP," June said. "And I'm thinking you need to call them before you lose more cattle, not after. And I'm thinking," she paused, "I'm thinking you should let me come with you when you do, because I can tell them what I found and when." Harold was quiet for a long time. "Managed my own affairs for 40 years, he said. "I know," June said, "but you don't have to manage them alone." That is one of those sentences that sounds simple and isn't. Harold heard the whole of it. He sat there for another moment, and something in his face shifted. Not dramatically, not the way things shift in stories, but in the small way a real thing shifts when a person decides to let someone else carry part of the weight. "All right," he said. The RCMP came out the following afternoon. A corporal named Tessayer and a constable who wrote things down in a notebook and asked careful questions. June showed them the fence. She showed them the photographs and the coordinates. She told them about the 11 missing cattle and the 2 additional fence sections and the dates she'd found them. Corporal Tesseri took his own photographs and told Harold he'd be in touch, and thanked June by name before he left. Harold didn't say anything about that, but that evening he brought 2 cups of coffee to the bunkhouse step. June had been sitting on the step after supper watching the first stars come out over the ridge, and handed her one and sat down on the step beside her. They drank their coffee and looked at the sky, and Harold said, "You know your way around a fence line." "I do," June said. "Not many people do anymore." "No," she agreed. "Not many." They sat there a while longer. The stars came out the rest of the way. What happened next came slowly, the way most good things do, and also the way most true things do. Not as a single event, but as a series of small ones that only look like a pattern when you step back far enough to see them all together. The missing cattle were found 2 weeks later in a pasture on the Vickers property, mixed in with the Vickers herd and rebranded, done sloppily, which was the thing that undid Merv Vickers in the end. The RCMP laid charges. Gordon Vickers, it turned out, had known nothing about what his son had been doing, and when he found out, he called Harold directly. That phone call lasted 11 minutes. Dorothy listened from the kitchen doorway and didn't say anything. After it was over, just went to the sink and started washing dishes, which was how she handled things that moved her. The 11 cattle came home. By December, the routine at Harwick Creek had a different feel to it. Or maybe it was the same feel, only June was part of it now, in a way she hadn't been in October. She had stopped thinking of the bunkhouse as temporary. She had fixed the broken rocking chair on the porch, which had required more work than anticipated because the runner was cracked all the way through, and when she was done, Dorothy had sat in it one evening and said, "I haven't sat in this chair in 4 years," and that was all she said, but that was enough. June wrote a letter in December. She wrote it to her sister in Halifax, whom she hadn't spoken to in the better part of a year. She sat at the small desk in the bunkhouse with the wood stove ticking beside her, and she wrote 3 pages in longhand about the ranch, about Harold and Dorothy, about the work and the cold, and the way the light looked over the foothills in the morning. She didn't write about Lethbridge or about Marcus or about the 18 months of being unmoored. She didn't need to. Her sister would understand what the letter meant without being told. She addressed it and put a stamp on it and left it on the kitchen counter to go with the next day's mail. Dorothy saw it in the morning and didn't say anything about it, but she made a point of taking it to the mailbox herself, which June noticed and understood. The snow came properly in January. The work changed. Less riding, more hauling, more breaking ice in the water troughs, more watching the herd for signs of illness in the cold. Harold and June fell into the work side by side without discussion, each filling in the gaps the other left in the way that happens between people who have been paying attention to each other. Dorothy brought lunch out to them on the days when coming back to the house would have meant losing too much daylight, and she had started asking June in the evenings about growing up north of Pincher Creek, and June had started answering in more detail than she usually answered things. One evening in January, Harold came to the bunkhouse step again. He stood rather than sat this time, which meant he had something to say and wasn't sure how to say it. "We've been talking," he said. "Dorothy and I," June waited. "We're not young," Harold said. "And this land," he stopped. He looked out at the dark pasture and the stars and the ridge beyond it. He was not a man who spoke easily about the things he felt most about, and June had learned to let the silences between his words carry their own weight. "This land deserves someone who'll work it like it matters," he said. "Someone who isn't going to be here for a season and then gone." June looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "No," Harold said. "I don't think you are." He didn't say anything else. He went back inside. But before the screen door closed behind him, June heard Dorothy say something from the kitchen, and she heard Harold's answer, and though she couldn't make out the words, she could hear the tone of them. Easy and settled and unhurried. The tone of a conversation between 2 people who have been talking to each other for 40 years and know how to do it without rushing. She sat on the step for a while after that, listening to the quiet. There is a particular kind of quiet you only find in the foothills in January. It's not empty. It's full of things, the sound of wind moving through the spruce at the edge of the property, the distant sound of cattle shifting in the night, once the yip of a coyote far up the ridge. But it's a quiet that asks nothing of you, which is the rarest kind. June had been running from something, or toward something, or both. She was no longer entirely sure which for a long time, and what she found, sitting on the step of a bunkhouse on a cattle ranch on the eastern slopes of the Canadian Rockies in the deepest part of winter, was that the running had stopped, not because something had caught her, because she had found a place worth stopping for. Spring came the way it always comes in that country. Grudgingly, and then all at once, patches of bare ground appearing in the south-facing slopes in March, and then mud everywhere, and then almost overnight, green coming back into the hills. The calving started in April, which was its own kind of chaos and its own kind of wonder, all those mornings in the barn at 3 and 4 o'clock, with the cold still thick and a new calf coming into the world in the lamplight, June and Harold working by instinct and without a lot of words. One morning in late April, while they were waiting on a heifer who was taking her time about things, Harold said, without preamble, "There's going to be a lease arrangement for the land." June looked up. "A formal one," Harold said. "Dorothy and I talked to our son in Calgary. We're not selling. But we need someone managing this place who has a stake in it, not just a hired hand." He looked at her steadily. "If you're interested." June thought about the bunkhouse and the rocking chair she'd fixed, and the water line to the west dugout, and the fence line on the north boundary, and the 11 cattle that had come home, and the letter she'd written her sister, and the quiet in January. "I'm interested," she said. Harold nodded, as though this was what he had expected, and turned his attention back to the heifer. The calf came an hour later, a heifer herself, black and wet and entirely indignant about being born. June held her while she found her legs, and Harold watched from the gate with his arms folded, and outside the barn, the sun was coming up over the ridge, and the hills were going gold with it, and the dog was barking at something in the south pasture, and the creek was running high with snowmelt, and the world was doing what it always does in April in that country, which is begin again. Dorothy had coffee waiting when they came in. She looked at June's face and then at Harold's, and she smiled, just slightly, just enough, and poured the coffee and set it on the table, and the three of them sat down together the way people sit down who belong at the same table. Some things take time to become what they always should have been. That's not a failure. That's just how it works.